Now, Harry Reid said back in 2012, hey, you know what? Those guys who were asking us to do filibuster reform, like Senator Merkley and Senator Udall, they had a really good point. I think they might have been right along. Golly gee, it seems like the Republicans really have been blocking all of our legislation for the last 4 years. So people who were interested in filibuster reform got a little excited by that. Obviously, Harry Reid, enormously important character for this particular rule. At the beginning of each Congress, the people who are in the majority, in this case Harry Reid's party, could change the rules. And they don't need 60 votes, they only need 50 votes in the vice president. They had plenty of votes to be able to do that. So they asked Harry Reid, hey, can you really do filibuster reform this time? And he huffed and puffed and pretended that he was interested in it. And then he cut a terrible deal with the Republicans, in which case he got a couple of procedural things that only he cared about, but that affect the process in no discernible way in terms of real legislation we all care about. And he shook hands with the Republicans and said, don't worry, I'm going to leave your filibuster alone, and I'm going to let you run roughshod with it and do whatever you want. And at the time, he had this hilarious quote: these reforms will allow us to deal with legislation in a more timely fashion and weaken the ability of those who seek to obstruct for obstruction's sake. It is my hope that these reforms will help restore a spirit of comedy. Oh, that says in people getting along. Well, isn't that lovely? That sounds terrific. How's that comedy working out for you? It's more like comedy. Come on. Can you be this pathetic? This much of a loser? That you thought the Republicans wouldn't do obstruction? That they wouldn't block every important piece of legislation you had with a filibuster? Nobody can be that stupid. Harry Reid, please tell me you're not that dumb, are you? No, Harry Reid is paid to lose. He's a professional loser. So what he does is he goes to the Republicans and say, what would you like? Oh, absolutely, sir. Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. I will keep the filibuster in place, but I will do fig leaf reform. I'll just throw a leaf on it and say, oh, we changed it. We changed it. Hey, did you actually change it? Of course not. And we just move along. Now, to give you a sense of how much power the filibuster gives to Republicans, I want to give you a sense of perspective. Now, in 1790, Virginia was the largest state. Delaware was the smallest state. Now, this is, of course, when our country begins, right? And we've got the Senate, and they're get in there. Now, Virginia was 12.65 times the size of Delaware. So now our biggest state was significantly larger than our smallest state. Now, remember, this is very important because the senators are only 2 senators from each state, no matter how large or how small. But that equation has changed. Now, in 2010, or that's the last numbers we have, California is the largest state. Wyoming is the smallest state in terms of population. And California now is 66 times the size of Wyoming. So let me show you a chart here. Now, it actually used to be worse in the 1900s when Nevada first became a state. It was very low population in Nevada, and New York was so much larger. That's why you see the graph spike in the middle there. But as you can see, where we are today is literally 5 times higher than when we started in 1790 in terms of how disproportionate the large states are versus the small states. So what does that do? It gives the small states disproportionate power. So somebody did an analysis where the senators that voted for the gun legislation represented approximately 2/3 of the country's population. 2/3 of the country's population is a sad day for you. You don't get what you want because the small states have enormous power. Now, here's something really interesting. What is the percentage of the country that can block a piece of legislation? Since the small states have more power, do you know that if you combine the small states together, it only takes 17.82% of the population to get a majority in the U.S. Senate? So about 18% of the population can block any bill because the small states have too much power. In fact, here, let me show you a chart on that. And you see that it's a smaller and smaller percentage of people you need to be able to block legislation because the small states get bigger and bigger power. Now, you add in the filibuster and it gets comical. Now, the small states can band together, and remember, in the gun issue, it's very important because the rural states are not as much in favor of gun control as the more urban cities And obviously New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, they're centered in very, very large states. So this is why it's incredibly relevant. You give them the ability to filibuster on top, the states that represent only 11.2% of the population can block any bill in the Senate. If they can just cobble together 11.3%, let's be generous to them, 11.3% of the population, or people that represent 11.3% of the population, they can block any bill that 89% of us agree with. Now, add one more thing to that. It's much easier to buy a small state senator. Now, if you want to buy a senator from California, you're going to have to spend money in San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and the list goes on and on. It's really expensive to buy a senator from California. But if you're a lobbyist and you make small donations to small state senators, that goes a long way. It doesn't take that much to buy ads in Butte, Montana. That's why Max Baucus is one of the most corrupt politicians in all of America. When he was in charge of healthcare reform, he gets the most amount of money from the healthcare companies. It was incredibly easy to buy him. So when you put all those things together and then you give them a filibuster, you've handed over all of your power to people who are easily bought by donors and lobbyists. And then we can't get anything done. And then that loser, Harry Reid, comes out as he did yesterday, and he seems so angry, and he's like, oh, I am going to vote for the assault weapons ban and the high-capacity magazines ban, and golly gee, I can't believe we didn't pass the universal background check. Well, we didn't pass it because of your sorry ass. Now, if I know all of this, you don't know this, Harry Reid? You don't know the amount of power you gave over to the Republicans? You know it, but you're paid to lose. The same donors give money to Harry Reid and say, hey, play ball, let the conservative Democrats and the Republicans kill any meaningful legislation that we corporate interests are opposed to. Be a good boy, and you get to go back in and pretend you're a leader of men. Harry Reid is such a huge part of the problem in America.